Well, hey everybody. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking about this topic of injustice. Because here's the thing, is we all know that there are events and experiences that aren't fair and aren't just in our world today. And in theory, we wish that somebody, somewhere, anybody, would just start to shift those situations from bad to good. But when we begin to think about all the injustice in the world, even if it's just the injustices that we've personally been talking about, it can start to feel really overwhelming. So much so that we start to disengage and we try not to think about it just really out of self-preservation. But there are probably questions that have bubbled up inside of you over this series. Things like, well, what should I do? Or what can I do? That really become just too much to think about. Because after all, when it comes to actually making a difference in the world, you may ask yourself, well, what can I really do as a high school student? Now, remember, just to keep us all on the same page, we've been defining the terms justice and injustice throughout this series. And when we've talked about justice, we've talked about something being right, fair, or equal. And that's how we've defined justice. And we've talked about injustice as well, because that's just the opposite of justice. Because when we talk about injustice, we're talking about the things in our world that are unfair, unequal, or not right. The things that are unfair, unequal, are not right. So for example, things like people getting bullied at school, that's injustice. Victims of human trafficking, injustice. Families in poverty, injustice. Students not having tools or resources or internet access to keep up with their classes, that's an injustice. Kids not having meals on days when there's no school breakfast or lunch, injustice. Women not being paid the same as men for the same job, that's injustice. People being treated differently and being discriminated against, that's injustice. The list goes on and on. And when you think about it this way, chances are you can see plenty of areas of injustice in our world. But I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to say, because it's the whole point of this series. And this can be a phrase that I believe could pass right through your mind with no effect, or it could really change the course of your life if you allow it to get a hold of your heart. So the whole purpose of this series has been centered around this idea that you are somebody who could do something. That you are somebody who could do something. In other words, you have the ability to do good in a world filled with lots and lots of bad. And the work isn't easy or fast. And everyone that is ready to do something, they have to be committed to being in this for the long haul. But here's the thing, is when you dive into working towards justice, you can typically, probably pretty quickly, feel overwhelmed and apathetic. Because you realize that working towards justice can be emotionally, mentally, and even spiritually exhausting to deal with and to fight against as you work towards justice in our world. And as much as we talk about, pray about, and do something about injustice, the reality is to you that it truly feels like a problem that just can't be solved. I mean, maybe you're thinking that injustice has always happened and it's still happening. So is there really any hope to actually change it? Or maybe you're wondering how you, just one person, can make a difference in a huge problem like racism or human trafficking or sexism or poverty or so much more. And is it even possible for one teenager to make a difference in a meaningful way? Or maybe you're just so tired of talking about it and so tired of trying to explain it to people who just don't seem to care that you wonder, is it really worth trying anymore? Will people ever truly care as much as you do? Or maybe you've personally experienced injustice so long that you wonder if saying anything or doing anything is really going to make a dent in the problem. You say, well, it hasn't done anything so far, so why would it now? Or maybe you find yourself wrestling with the idea that, is there any way that all of this bad could possibly become something good? And here's the thing, if you're wrestling with any of those questions or maybe others, I get it. Because here's the thing, is standing up and doing something about injustice isn't easy. It's overwhelming. It's something that feels like, well, there should be somebody bigger or stronger or older or more powerful or somebody with more influence. They should be the ones stepping in and doing something. But remember what we said. You can be that somebody. You can be that somebody to step in and to make a difference. And so to get us started today, we're going to look at some words from a guy named James. And what's interesting about James is that James was actually the half-brother of Jesus. Now just imagine growing up in that household. And here's the thing, is James didn't really believe that Jesus was the Son of God while he was here on earth. He didn't put his hope and trust and faith in him. He doubted. But then after Jesus died and was raised back to life, James realized, hey, he's legit. He's the real deal. And so he gets more involved in the ministry of his brother. He goes from being mostly absent in Jesus' ministry while he was here on earth to after his death and resurrection to coming back to traveling all over the world and telling people about his brother Jesus that had died and risen from the dead. And what changed? What altered James's perception? Well, chances are it was probably the fact that his brother said, hey, I'm going to die and then I'm going to come back to life. And he did it. And so at that point, he's like, oh, I probably need to believe that my brother is who he says he is, which is the Son of God. And so James believed that his brother was genuinely God in human form. And this is one of the reasons that we know the resurrection actually happened. Because Jesus' own brother saw him die, watched him be raised back to life, and wrote down the experiences that he saw and the things that took place when all of this happened. And James goes on to write a letter to a group of Christians who were facing severe injustice. And he challenged them by saying these words. He says, suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? You see, when you put it that way, it sounds pretty heartless. But you know what? If we're really honest, I think that's what we're all tempted to do sometimes. Is that when we see the hugeness of a problem and we don't really know how to solve it, we often just settle for saying or posting something, but really doing nothing. For example, when we see something unjust happening in our town, we think about how bad it is. We may even say so, but sometimes that's where our involvement ends. Or when we see somebody struggling to have their needs met, we might say, well, we'll pray for them. And we do that. But of course, we don't want to get in their business, so it stops there. And we don't do much else. Or when we see racial injustice happening in our country, we might post about it on our social media feeds, but then we move on. We don't tend to get into the harder work of actually learning about it or speaking up about it or standing up to it when we see it happening. And this, by the way, it's not a generational thing. Thinking about it is good. Praying about it is powerful. Posting about it is important. And all of that is good. But if our doing something good stops there, then we've missed what it means to truly follow Jesus. Because you see, following somebody means that you would do the kind of thing that they would do. And Jesus was in the habit of always doing good in the face of injustice when it took place all around him. Maybe you've heard about how he spoke up for the poor. He cared for the sick. He hung out with people who were outcasts. He confronted leaders who were treating people unfairly. And did Jesus offer his words? Absolutely. But he also offered his actions. He lived in a way that showed the world, hey, this is what it looks like to value people. And we, as his followers, need to be willing to do the same. James continues on in his letter, and here's what he says. He says, in the same way, faith by itself, if not accompanied by action, is dead. So James was saying that our faith and our actions are connected. In other words, if we say we have faith, but it doesn't motivate us to do something, then something about our faith is broken, incomplete, or lacking. And here's why this is such a big deal, is because living a life of faith is about becoming more like Jesus. And if you've missed any of the parts of this series so far, here's what I want you to remember, is that when it comes to injustice, Jesus was always doing some good. Always. And so when we make a shift to allow our prayers or our words to turn into action, we are becoming more like the person that we're praying to, which is Jesus. We're becoming more like him. So in other words, when the things that make you feel sad or angry because you know they're not right, or the injustices that motivate you to act, or the things that hurt you and hurt the people that you love, those are all things in the world that God wants to see made right. They're bad things. We're not arguing with that or disagreeing with that. And we're called as Jesus followers to shift those things towards good. To not just tossing some good here and there and sprinkling in some nice things that you can look back and say, yeah, that's good enough. We're called to do more. Because good enough is never good enough. Justice never stops. There's no line on a measuring cup that will tell us, hey, okay, you've done enough. You're good enough. That's good enough. There's not a finish line to doing good, especially when it comes to justice, because it's an ongoing effort, a lifelong commitment. And here's the thing, when you dive into working for justice, it will feel overwhelming. It will feel like our little actions won't really have any importance on a giant problem. But small changes are still changes, and they're good changes in the right direction. Now, some of you get this because you've been doing good about some of the problems, some of the injustices that you see in our world for a long time. You've been speaking up for people, showing up to help, posting about it, working towards justice. And because of that, here's what you know for sure, is that it's exhausting. Doing something means you have the same conversations over and over again. It means you don't show up just one time and check a box and move on. You show up again and again and again. And it also means that it may feel like it's not working. You may feel like you're fighting a losing battle, that every little thing that you're doing isn't working or isn't adding up. And you probably feel discouraged at times, wondering, hey, is this really a battle that can even be won? And if that's you, I want you to hear from somebody else who met Jesus, who hung out with his followers, including James, the brother of Jesus, and spoke to people facing huge injustice. His name is Paul, and here's what the Apostle Paul had to say in Galatians chapter 6. He says, "Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Therefore, as we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people." In other words, don't get weary when you're doing good. Don't give up. Don't give in when the good work gets hard. Instead, keep going, keep working, keep fighting. And Paul would know, because if you take a deep dive into his story, you'd see that he used to be one of the people who was the most prejudiced and unjust people in the world. But after he encounters Jesus, he turns his whole life around and he commits himself to doing good. Now, the work that you're doing for the injustices in the world that break your heart, they aren't new. And that means that the battle between doing something good and something against injustice isn't new either. There are people that have been fighting to right the wrongs and do the good work for decades and centuries. And little by little, there has been change. There has been progress. And I'm so grateful that those people didn't give up. They didn't become weary in doing good. And the same can be true for you and I today. That when it comes to injustice, never stop doing something good. It may feel impossible, but little by little, we can start to change the world. Because like James says, we keep doing something good. Because good enough is never good enough. Because justice never stops. So today I want to give you some practical things to do to continue to do good when you battle against injustice. First is to use your voice, is to say something in the moment. Say something on social media. Say something to a teacher or an adult who can help. Use the voice that you have, that God has given you, to speak up and to speak out for those who need it. And if it doesn't work initially, keep saying it until it does. So use your voice. Second, use your influence. Maybe people listen to you in your friend group, and use that influence to talk about injustice with them. Maybe your family has resources that can help somebody else in need, and ask how you can use those. Or maybe your family has connections and you can use those as opportunities. Or maybe you can use your opportunities to help somebody else get more opportunities. So use your influence. Third, use your talents. You don't have to give up on basketball or theater or Spanish class or whatever hobbies you have. Use the talent that God has given you to do good for other people. Lean into what you're good at and do good for other people. Maybe use your art to do something about injustice that you see in your school. Or maybe you can use the fact that you're on a sports team to get your whole team to speak up and serve for others. So use your talent. Maybe you can use the opportunity that you have at your school as a tutor to help kids who need it. And if you aren't sure where to start or how to start or even what you have to offer, then ask God to show you. Ask your small group leader. Ask a trusted adult. They can tell you not only what talents they see in you, but you can start to brainstorm with them ideas to put the things you have to work for the sake of others. And then finally, use your life. We're not talking about just one service project or not signing up just to volunteer a few times. Injustice is everywhere. And part of following Jesus is making a commitment to do good and to keep doing good. It's making a lifelong commitment to do the work. And of course, that means you have to take care of yourself in the process. You need to find people who can encourage you, who can remind you that, hey, what you're doing is making a difference even when it doesn't seem like it is. Now, you may remember when we started this series, we talked about that in the beginning, God created the world that we live in. And He said that it was good. And the world doesn't always live up to the goodness that God first created. But there's also a part of God's good creation, which is us. And we have the ability to infuse good back into the world where injustice has crept in, where it starts to taint things and cause issues. And maybe before this series, you never thought that God cared about or even noticed injustice. But injustice is a big, bad issue that can sometimes feel impossible to overcome. But we're calling you, as the next generation, to do more than just good enough. And so before we wrap up, I want you just to pause with me for a minute. And as we're wrapping up this series, I want you to imagine this. What if the church actually lived this out? Not just our church, but the church. The entire community of people who follow Jesus. How might people in your school or your neighborhood see God differently if Christians were known for choosing to see people the way that God sees them? If they saw that people were treating people the way that God treats them. You see, it's not impossible. And when you begin to think and imagine that kind of future, it's actually filled with possibility. And here's what's wild. This can happen, but only if we do some good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and for checking out this final video in our series, And It Was Good. As we've went through this, we hope that it's been beneficial and encouraging to you. We want to remind you of the practical things that we've encouraged you to do, to use your voice, to use your influence, use your talents, and use your life as you work towards justice in our world, which is ultimately all about creating a better tomorrow for everybody. So would you consider joining us? Whether you join us here in person on Sunday nights from 6 to 8 p.m., or whether you join us as we work towards justice in our world and showing that, hey, God not only cares about it, but God cares about you. And God desires for you to bring good into the world. So will you join us on this journey as we work towards justice and fight against injustice? Have a great and wonderful rest of your day and an amazing week. We hope to see you in person soon. And check us out next week as we kick off a special new one-week series. Have a great and wonderful rest of your day.